Hi, I'm Tahl Niran. I'm a compositor, freelance compositor, and I also do some teaching with FX PhD, who are partial sponsors of the event. Just a quick show of hands, who knows what FX PhD is and what they do? And so a good chunk of you, right? For those who don't know, basically they're not so much a training organisation as an online community where people like myself and Frank and Matt and other people get on board and show stuff. So it's more aimed at visual effects professionals rather than people coming into the industry. So that was my quick ad that I was told to do. And now that I've paid for my flight over,
here's your check.
we could get started. I think I need to switch the vision to me. Yeah,
want to see Tahl.
vision to me. So a lot of people who I've come into contact with is via the Shake community because I spend a lot of time as a Shake compositor, and I suppose I'm more known for being a Shake user than a NUKE user, unlike someone like Frank who's very well known in the NUKE community. So part of what I wanted to show today was transitioning across, because I think a lot of people are in the position where they look at the development of both applications and they realise that there's a huge potential for the development of NUKE and maybe not so much for the other guys. So what I would do is just basically start at the beginning and launch Shake and just have a look at some of the differences that,
There it was, he said Shake.
I've been waiting all day to do that, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Basically I wanted to show you a couple of things. Steve Jobs always gets up and goes, I've got 3 things to show you today, I've got 3 things to show you today. Because everything's on Mac, I've got 3 things to show you today. So this is the first thing I'm going to show you, which is a sort of a simplified version of UV projections, rendering into UV space with projections, which is sort of similar to what Justin showed on FX Guide TV, and with the mummy and all that sort of stuff. And he did a really cool thing, and mine's much simpler, but it's a little bit easier to understand. So I was going to show you the integration between 2 scenes. We have this scene over here in Maya, and it's really simple. There's a little mini, and it's sort of, hold on, turn textures on. It's really important because you've got to see, there's the Foundry logo. So there's a little mini, and it's sort of going out of the scene. And what I wanted to show you is an example of people who are working maybe in a smaller shop, and you've got 1 or 2 seats of Maya and 1 seat of compositing, or even you've got people who are working between compositing and 3D, and being able to sort of work flexibly between the 2 simultaneously. So Matt sort of showed a little bit about that, taking Chan files back and forth. And this is mainly using FBX, because FBX really does work quite well now, and it's something that Autodesk have integrated into most of their packages. And it seems to be becoming one of the standard interchange formats for geometry and cameras and things like that in the industry. So this is the first example I'll show you. I'm trying to rush through this really quickly because there's so much to get through. And I've got another one which is a more straightforward 2D compositing thing, which is hopefully you'll all be looking forward to. It's been a very 3D heavy day, I know. We're trying to sort of show some of the features that are unique to NUKE, and we don't need to show you how to do a Bezier or how to do a Luma key or something like that, because the application can do that. It can key, it can track. We're trying to show you what's unique and what isn't necessarily available directly in the manual. So that's why a lot of what we've seen today has been very 3D heavy and very geometry heavy and different unusual features. So hopefully that sort of brings it into context a little bit. So I'll just jump back to my scene. So what I've got here is basically the OBJ data directly and FBX data directly out of my scene. Here's the room and here's a still. And if I just switch back to my 2D mode, this is just a still that someone gave me a long time ago for a tutorial that he was working on, and it just gave me an idea of how I could implement Justin's technique of rendering out UV maps from NUKE Scanline Renderer in a really simple way. So it's just a still, no idea about the camera data, no idea about the distortion. I'm much more the sort of person who tries to relate my demos to production rather than it going really slick. So if things screw up, it's because it's more realistic, not because I'm incompetent, okay? So this is like the sort of thing, the agency comes in, they say, we want this shot, we want a car leaving the room, and it's going to be cool, and we want a camera move on it, and we've done all this research for you, and here's a still. And they go, make it cool. When we've all sort of been in that situation in production. So here's a still, and what Matt Leonard has kindly done for me in Maya is he's just matched up the still by eye in a really basic way. Oh, it hasn't got my hotkeys. It's all right. Show the camera. You've got to forgive me. I used to be, in a former life, I was a Maya artist, so I sort of remember it, but I don't as well. So where's my camera? Anyway, he's lined up the camera, and yeah, it's not there. Lined up the camera and done a really basic projection lineup, just in the same way that he did the building earlier on today, right? And that camera's in the scene, and it's No, it's all turned on. It's a display layer, you think. No, they're all on. Ah, well, it's your fault. It's mine. Anyway, and so there's a camera in the scene. That camera's being exported out to FBX, right? And it's a render layer is what the problem is. Bloody Mira, it's render layers. There you go. There's everything in the scene. There's my camera. You can see the camera sort of moving around in the scene. And at frame 1 is the lineup of the position of the camera that we're going to be using for our projections in NUKE, right? So we've just taken this camera at frame 1. Here's the camera. It's an FBX. Which has been read from file. If I just maximise this screen, just to show you that there's the FBX. And I've just turned off that read from file attribute because if you want to clone or do anything like that with cameras, if you're using an FBX camera with read from file still ticked on, it can cause problems. And similarly, if you want to do something dodgy, which is what I'm about to do, and cheat your projections to get away from the difficult things, you see there's this little sort of Terry Toweling type doily thing going on here. I didn't want to have to deal with that in the transparencies when I did the camera move, so I just sort of cropped the projection in such a way, which I'll show you here. Crop the projection in such a way so that it sort of chops it out of the door frame, and I just did that by turning off the read from file, and it allows me to tweak the horizontal aperture so I can kind of slide the projection in and out, right? And I just undo that. Oh God, after 7 years of Shake, it's so nice to be able to undo. I just can't tell you. I could just sit here all day and just go back, forward, back. Anyway, but I love them, love the app. Anyway, moving on. So that's what I've done. I've just got this projection, and you can see here that I'm using the read node, and I've just shuffled black into the alpha. Shuffle white to the alpha, beg your pardon, and I've just put a Bezier on there. And the reason I've done that back in 2D World is I've just defined what's inside the room and what's outside the room because I'm going to use different pieces of geometry for both, right? So I've just chopped the door, and as I said, I've avoided the complicated doily bit, and I've just projected one down with a pre-melt, which looks like that, right? And that's the projection, that's what you see here, right? And then I've done another one for the door, right? So that's projecting like the reverse of that Bezier, and I've done a third one, which is the actual door itself, because it's sort of coming off at an angle. So if I open them all up, I can actually see them all in the viewport. So that's a bit of an interesting gag. A lot of people freak out about this in NUKE, and I might just take a moment to show you that having the nodes open and closed, even though they're not all in a scene together, because there's no scene node in here, but if I have them all open in my properties bin, I can actually see them all in the 3D view. As soon as I start to shrink them down, they pop off. So that freaks a lot of people out about NUKE. So if you're new to NUKE and it's 3D, that's something to sort of, a little bit of a gotcha. Okay, so everyone's with me so far, right? I've got 3 separate objects, 3 separate projections, rather similar to what Matt did this morning with the building and the street as the background. The benefit is that I can render these out individually in a UV mode and extend the textures, because the gag is if I want to move the camera from its starting position around the room, as soon as I move it, I'll just go to this point and lock it. As soon as I move it beyond, oh sorry, I shouldn't have locked it. As soon as I move it like that, I'm going to see that there's no projection. So I'm going to tweak it in such a way that I can move my camera freely, and I'll just paint in 2D all the details here. And it will allow me to move the camera around the room. And also, I've got a mirror here, right? And it's too hard to solve the problem with the reflections. I'm not going to even deal with it. I'm just going to paint over the top, right? So that's what I've done in my next scene. Is really, really basically, I've just, actually I can jump back for a second to show you how it works. Is in the scanline renderer, I've just made another camera, and I'll just hide up some of this geometry because it'll be easy to see if I do this right. Cool, so go back to my default view and just frame it up. There we go. So in this scanline renderer, what I've actually done is I've rendered this out with a new camera. And this is just a nominal camera. It could be anywhere in the scene, but it doesn't work if you don't have another camera going into your scanline renderer. But I've just turned it into UV mode. Right? And this is the crux of this whole demonstration with the room, is just using this projection mode UV. By default, you render out of NUKE scanline renderer in something like render camera, right? Or perspective mode, right? And that'll give you like a camera as you expect it. But as Matt said, and as we'll see later on, there are different modes. So orthographic just gives you straight off the graphics. Spherical is really good for doing unwraps, which we'll do in the next demo. But UV allows you to spit these things out in UV space, right? So if I'll go back to Maya and have a look at the UV that I've done, and I could have just as easily done these UVs using Projector Uv like Matt did this morning in Maya. Directly in NUKE. You can just project the UVs and do them. But just to get multiple UV sets and stuff can be a bit of a pain in the ass. So I did it this way. And I've just laid these out in the most clumsy fashion, but there are like the UVs for the four walls, the two walls and the roof, right? And that's the door, obviously. And that way, the map that I'm producing out of my UV render in NUKE corresponds to that, right? Because this is like the wall with the door, and this is what's taken from the projection of the roof, and this is what's taken from the projection of the floor, and the other wall. And I've done the same thing for all the other geometry, like I've just spat it out in its own scanline renderer. And just for people who don't already know, you don't actually need to have a scene node to do things. You don't need to have an axis node. You can slim down your comps a lot just using the nodes you need to use. So you can plug a projection straight into the geo, render it. And because you don't need any other sort of containers to hold the file data, right? So there's the corridor, and the same way this is the door itself, right? So that's giving me the door. And I like, someone called these splat maps. I really like that name. It's like a splat map where you're splatting out the UVs. So what I've done is I've used a constant because it overrides the global settings of my scene. It doesn't really matter what the global settings of my scene. The scanline renderer will output the resolution of constant. So I've used the 1K square, but you could just as easily use any nominal value in there, right? So if you want to have really high res texture maps to put back on your image, you just stick it like, a 4K constant in there, and it'll give you out the UVs laid out, smeared at 4K. All right, there might be some, we're going from a reasonably low res image here, there might be some of a texture hit there, but if you're repainting the textures anyway, it doesn't matter. It'll just give you like the positioning, okay? So I'm not actually going to do it right now, but I went to Photoshop and just extended out these textures really basically just using like clone and heal brush and just painted in, where everything was. And you can go in and output the UV texture map as like a cage. Well, everyone who's done texture painting knows the leaf gags anyway. You output the texture map like that as a UV, and then you can see where to paint and where the extents of your UV are so that you can line everything up. Yeah. And then I painted this thing, and I painted over I just stuck a poster over the mirror, and I put like, a little bit of something here, and I did some really awesome drips. And but just basically the gag was I just wanted to extend out the textures, right? So the main thing of what I wanted to show was I've got this this guy here, right? And what this switch allows me to do is I can switch between the old texture, showing you where this is where the projection begin and end, and the checkerboard's showing you all the extents of it. And if I switch back to my thing, you can see how much extra stuff I've filled in, right? And so it's given me all this, it's extra texturing. And like I said, it's production. I screwed up the seam here. And I screwed up the seam here, but I don't need to fix it, it's fine, it'll work. I did the same thing for the background, right? I went in and I did the corridor and I extended it outwards. So the corridor goes all the way out to here, and there's my door, and the door's actually stuck on top of, I'll turn these off and you'll see, there we go. Cool, so what I did was I painted out the door and I put the door on its own thing, so if we wanted to move in such a way we wouldn't actually have the door smearing across the projection. And that gave me basically a room which is being textured live using UV maps, and it's really fast. I mean, this is tumbling in the views really fast, it's really easy. And that's the scene that I'm going to be working with. Now the reason I did this one, I didn't do it all in Maya, was because the logic was, all right, we're going to be a really small shop, we've got like a day to turn this around kind of thing. So we'll have the 3D guy out here doing the stuff that you can do in Maya, which is animating this little car, right? Which is a Mini, I believe. And it's animated in the most pathetic way using a motion path, and it just sort of hoiks out the door, and the camera's being animated in Maya. At least they haven't called it Shake yet. And it's moving around, and as we saw earlier today with Matt's scripts, we can pass the data back and forth. So you could do the gross move, for example, in NUKE, and then export it out using a cham file, bring it to Maya, tweak the animation. So coming back into NUKE, what I want to do is use Maya's renderer, and in this case we're using Mental Ray, for what it's really good for, which is things like reflections, transparency, shadows, all that kind of stuff, and use NUKE for the quick and dirty solution for the background in my room, because it's not really, it's only a broadcast project in this example, it's not really essential that we have the highest quality filtering on our textures. We can paint the texture maps at 2K if we need them, and then UV map them back on. And then I can get the render of this with its shadow, because as we said, you could fake the shadows for this quite easily, just projecting the shape back onto the geometry, but we might as well just use soft shadows from an area light in Maya, which is what I've done, right? So I've got like a really basic area light set up, and literally, it's 3 lights. It's like directional area. It's pretty lame, and as you see, the The result's not the most awesomest thing ever, but what I wanted to show you was I've taken this FBX camera back into NUKE from Maya, and this is there we go. This is the animation that's been done of the room the camera in the room. So I can go to that view and just lock this to the camera button and just frame it up, and you can see here that once I've locked this, I can zoom in and out, and it's going to maintain what's the word I'm looking for? Perspective. Maintain coffee? Yeah. It's going to maintain the perspective so that I can just check everything that's like that. I can check that my texture extends far enough out. So if I'm going to hit the edge of my texture, I can just go back and extend it and paint it more. But there's the move that's coming out of Maya, and I can see here that there's my PAL 1024-576 square boundaries, and it's moving. It's all going good. The cool thing is that I can go back into 2D land using a scanline renderer, and I've just output the motion vectors just by connecting the camera to Motion Blur 3D. And because I'm doing camera motion blur on the background, I can get that data into a motion vector channel. I'm just told it to put it into the UV motion into motion channel, and now I have motion vectors, and I can use that down the bottom to get vector motion blur on top of everything. So just something that you may or may not have already been aware of is the tiles in NUKE tell you, or the nodes in NUKE tell you really useful things. For example, this tells me that there's RGB data here, but you see these extra ones over here are telling me that there's extra channels being output. Right? In the same way, if I'm fading something off or mixing something, I'll just do that here just for a laugh. There's my car, and I'll just look at that one. There's the shadow, right? So there's the shadow, which, just to prove a point, does fall on the wall. You see this, Simon? Yeah. Thank you. It's just, he cornered me in the pub yesterday and went, the shadow doesn't fall on the wall. It does. So you can see here that I've got a shadow being placed over here. I just spat out like an alpha matte and used it, and I can mix back the shadow, sort of fade it off. But what's really cool, if you haven't already noticed this in NUKE, is it gives me a little indication in the DAG view that I'm mixing it. So unlike a lot of other node-based compositors, you're constantly getting feedback in your DAG view about what's going on, right? And that's really useful because a lot of people who are transitioning from Shake to NUKE are like, well, I hate that I open up a panel and there's 70,000 operators, 70,000 parameters in my merge node over here and stuff, and I shouldn't have to dig through all these menus to find stuff and rah, rah, rah. But you don't. You just have to get used to reading the signs that are there, because there's all this information out here in the DAG view about mixing and extra channels and all that kind of stuff, right? So all I did was just take the render, which was done out of Maya, and that's the render here. There's the shadow alpha. It's doing that, and there's that one. There's the car, and it's lit really, even if I do say so myself, really poorly. And just put the whole lot together, and this is pretty much fast enough just to let it cache up quickly. It runs real time, right? So this is with the textures back on the comp. I mean, it's only like 3 layers, right? It's a really simple example, as I said, but it's nice being able to cache something up and watch it back, right? Which is something we've also had to live without for a long time. And there you go. That's the whole scene. So it's not really super complicated, but what it does is it shows you that we've got an environment here which is entirely generated in NUKE, bar the geometry, because the pixels and the textures and all that sort of stuff's coming from the NUKE projection, and then we have an asset which is coming from 3D, which is our car. I might zoom that up. That's going to screw up my caching because it's zoomed in. But there we go. And we've got a car which is being rendered out of Maya, and all these nice things because we just rendered it with a holdout in Maya. But you could generate your holdout in NUKE really easily, which we'll show you how to do later on. It sort of cuts it off where it needs to cut it off, and it overlays nicely. And the camera move lines up perfectly because we're translating FBXs from Maya to NUKE. So it's a nice sort of almost next-gen solution for bringing things back and forth between your applications. Obviously, in a big pipeline, you wouldn't do things this way. You'd plan your shots out more, but not everyone works in a big studio. A lot of people work in smaller studios, and you're going fast, you're rushing through things, and this is the way to get it done. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you today. I'm going to do what Roy did. Is there any questions about that at this stage? Yep. You want to just shout it out?
Yeah, you've done it with geometry from Maya. You built it in NUKE, just like simple planes and cubes and stuff. How does the UV work there? Can you just re-export it in the same way that you do that?
To repeat your question, you wanted to know if I built the geometry in NUKE, how would the UVs work? Well, the easy thing to do would be to use the Projector Uv. which we saw this morning, and just generate, like take the geometry and use a merge geo node, right, and just merge it all into a single piece of geometry, and then underneath that, just do a project UV, and you can just force the UVs to be however way you want them, right, because you have the option of doing planar or spherical or perspective projection of UVs in NUKE. So it is definitely an option. It's just one of those things where the ability to tweak on a vertice or individual UV basis is not there in the application, and Maya has that. So that's why I used it.
You can export it in the same way through the scanline render when you export it.
Yeah, it would exactly. If once you've projected the UVs, if you then go back to the UV render mode and scanline renderer, it'll give you the same result, or it's near enough to make no difference. Was there any other questions? All right, so everyone knows everything about that. Because if you don't, that's actually something that I'm showing on FX PhD as part of my NUKE course this term. So, sales pitch number 2. All right, so I'll quit out of Maya, and I won't save anything. And I'll show you the second thing I wanted to show you. And I've shown you that joke already.